Good afternoon. My name is Joe Bandel. Welcome to Deadly Days Tales of Dark Fantasy. This is actually Christmas Eve, and I thought it would be kind of neat to do a special story. This is a story by Paul Busson, and the title of the story is On the Holy Night. So it's kind of a Christmas story. Um, and Paul Busson is one of my favorite authors, so uh, it's kind of a neat story. It's never been translated into English before, so I will try to just go dive into it. Enjoy. Weren't there anything but Christmas trees in the dark woods through which the express train passed? In their green coniferous branches lay soft, fluffy snow, covered with fine crystals that glittered like gold and silver in the rays of the setting sun. But the old, white haired gentleman, traveling through the quiet and festive winter forest, in the well heated and cushioned room of his closed compartment, saw nothing of the wonders of snow and light. He was a hard man, whom no one loved, but many feared. Perhaps his heart lay buried under the rubble and ruins of destroyed hopes. Perhaps his gaze, which seemed to be directed into the void, was searching for that land where all those he had once loved were now staying. It may also be that he was searching for his heart, which was lost among the people he considered evil. He had given it to a worthy woman to play with at a young age, and received it back as a cinder from the fires of pain. Who can know what the tired old man was thinking about as he drove off into the sinking evening to spend Christmas with relatives in the capital? With cousins and relatives who, in view of the inheritance of the grumpy hermit's pride, endured his quirks for 2 days every year with sour smiles. Otherwise, he sat on his remote country estate, all alone in spacious and musty rooms filled with gloom and many shadows. Sometimes he felt as if he could hear the light step of bony feet outside his door on the eerie late fall nights when the north wind howled across the bare fields. Such days and nights only made him more withdrawn and merciless, and there was no one on the estate who had experienced or learned anything good from the Lord other than what was due to him by right. Well, there was the old man again going into the city. The train ran with wind speed toward its destination, playing catch with telegraph poles, chasing over thundering bridges under which flashing waters rushed, piercing the stone of the mountains and hurling white clouds of steam over the small, crouching houses that stood here and there along the route. But faster than the pawing and rattling iron beast, with people sitting in its belly, thick black clouds flew in from the west. At first, they only dropped tiny white flakes. But then the pack of black clouds pounced on the sun, adorned the clumped edges with stolen gold, and finally turned the whole sky into a murky gray turbulent sea from which large flakes swirled in ever denser falls. The wind blew full blast into the flurry, and soon there was nothing to be seen outside the window but a white, darkening wall that gradually swallowed up every last speck of light until everything was plunged into dark and howling night. The traveler cared very little about the weather outside and passed the time in his own way. In his head, he calculated the yield of a plot of woodland that he had cut down against the forester's wishes, sighed over the cost of repairing the sawmill, and finally read the financial report in his newspaper attentively and made all kinds of plans. But there was still something that bothered him and wouldn't let go. Was it the beaming face of a little girl with hanging pigtails who had boarded the train with her mother and with lots of parcels? Or the pleasant smell of pine needles, gingerbread, and wax candles that wafted into the waiting room from the district administrator's apartment? The mocking smile that wreathed the old man's thin lips gradually faded, and very shyly forgotten images rose up and faded away again before they had even taken shape. Was it not the voices of singing children that sounded from the pounding of the wheels? Oh, so many images and thoughts had passed through the aged head of the man who sat small and lonely on the red padded bench, staring at his glasses case on the folding table, which held its maw open like a small crocodile. Now and then the storm threw whole loads of snow against the windows with a dull thud, and at the bends you could hear the straining wheezing of the machine, which threw a rain of glowing sparks and black smoke into the flurry of flakes. The monotonous pounding gave the carriage a gentle shaking motion, a soporific rocking, and when the traveler closed his eyes for a moment, memory took possession of him. And in a precious moment he saw very near and clearly the dear and smiling face of his mother before him as she carefully lighted the lights of the richly decorated and glittering tree, and heard his brothers and sisters and himself singing an old and melancholy Christmas carol in bright voices. Divine Savior, head of Christendom, give what the fall of Adam robbed. Grant us your grace, wipe out the guilt of sin for everyone who believes. How sweet the voices sounded, how pure. Then the train stopped with an abrupt jerk, rolled back a little, came to a halt, pulled up again in a slow, hesitant movement, and then stopped in the middle of the dark night and snowfall. The images disappeared in an instant, and in their place, mean anger sprang up like weeds in the old man's soul. It was no pious song that came to his lips when a glance out of the angrily open window made him realize that they were standing in the middle of the railroad between waves of snow that had been pushed apart. Apparently, the locomotive's broad chest had been pushing through for as long as its strength lasted, but then it was pressed into the thick, heavy snow and could go no further. This was also revealed by the loud, excited voices of the train crew, who, wading knee-deep, held a consultation. The old man waited angrily for the train driver to appear. When the man with the red leather satchel and the lantern entered his compartment, the old man's anger erupted, and he showered the innocent man with a torrent of scolding. The poor train driver was quite hardened by his many dealings with excitable and ill-tempered travelers, but he immediately saw that this one was a particularly bad guest and tried to calm him down. The snowplow would be ordered by telephone from the nearest station house, and would have to be there in 2 hours at most. The conductor was already on his way to the guard's house. Nothing could be done. Perhaps the gentleman would like to try and get some sleep. But the old man could not be placated. He continued to grumble and said that even if he, the train driver, didn't care when they arrived, he, the ticket holder, did. He would show him. He could rely on that. And although the train driver himself was very sad because he always had to remember that his wife and children were waiting for him in vain with the Christmas tree, he said nothing and swallowed the undeserved rudeness and let the spiteful and agitated man alone. The sliding door slammed shut with a sharp noise, certainly more violently than was absolutely necessary. The landowner now had no one to vent his anger on but the newspaper, and so it flew out the window, rustling and crumpled, with all the thoughts, news, and advertisements and figures that had been painstakingly collected the day before. Yes, it was quiet now, and he had time to calm down. Nothing could be heard but the fine, whispering sound of falling flakes and the soft gurgling of the heating pipes. Sometimes, with a dull, heavy sound, a load of snow fell from one of the tall spruce trees that lined the iron path, motionless and gloomy. Despite the open window, the heat brooded in the carriage, and there was an oppressive smell of leather and soot. It was indeed an unbearable thought for someone who only found the quiet and often interrupted sleep of old age in the late hours of the night to spend several hours here. From the agony of this imagined thought, the traveler stepped into the corridor, opened the carriage door, and suddenly found himself standing in the deep snow next to the tracks, where the illumined carriages stood in a long row behind the powerless engine. It was certainly better here in the fresh, cool air than in the cramped chamber full of fumes and heat, and the old man turned toward the forest, unobserved by anyone. Here the flakes were not as thick as on the open road. You could actually see quite well between the trunks, and that was due to a peculiarly dim light that seemed to come from inside the forest. It was probably the shimmer of the white blanket that lay over the land. The snow was not deep here, and the path leading into the forest was clearly visible. The spruce trees had caught the snow trickling down with broad coniferous branches and were carrying heavy loads. The old man walked slowly and bent over, leaning towards the ground, like the branches all around him. Here in the deep forest, many things came out of the dark dungeon again. The Christmas spirit of the soul, in which it had lain imprisoned, welled up within him. Where were the merry oven fires that woke the boy with their loud crackling and red sparkling flames, so that his first glance fell on the wonderful things the Christ child had brought? Where was the children's laughter, bright and cheerful as finches? These were small, trifling things, worthless, and yet dear to the young heart. The crib in the corner of the room with the waxen baby Jesus and the three kings in stiff robes of gold and silk. There was a secret smell of baked apples and rosemary and a flicker of silver threads and colorful glass balls. The old wanderer smiled quietly to himself and went on his lonely way as if in a dream, thinking of the children of old, who today lay so well behaved and quiet in their narrow, cold beds, deep under withered greenery. But this was a wondrous forest. Right next to the path the hiker was following, all kinds of animals were moving forward in the same direction without hesitation. Deer, squirrels, and hares. Little birds fluttered ahead, branch to branch, as if they too were striving towards the light that always shone between the trees. And at one time, two strong men with wild beards, clad in coarse loden wool coats and carrying long iron-shod sticks, came out of the dark forest, followed by a herd of sheep. They also followed the path of the traveler. "Good evening, sir," greeted the first gray-bearded man. "Are you also looking for the light?" "Yes," said the old man, surprised at his own voice. A little fox jumped across the path, hopped for a moment, and then trotted on calmly as if it had never known the fear of man. "Every creature is awake today," said the graybeard. "It's a holy night, sir. We were called to bring help to a strange woman. We have been awakened from our sleep." They walked on in silence and soon stood in front of a miserable hut that looked like an abandoned stable. From the small window came the radiant glow that had attracted the hikers. They entered with bare heads. A young woman lay wrapped in blankets on a bed of straw and forest litter, smiling and gazing at a newborn child of great beauty. An elderly man with a kind and sorrowful face stood by the hearth, chopping wood next to the weak fire. All three looked up as the wanderers entered. The pale woman, the man at the hearth, and the child, whose large blue eyes shone mildly and seriously. "There was a knock at our door," said the old shepherd, making an awkward gesture with his hand, while the younger one looked sheepishly at his rough-nailed shoes. "Since you are so poor, we came to share our poverty with you, for the sake of the child who was born that night." The strange man by the fire thanked them with a friendly bow of the head, but the woman lifted the little child up and it stretched out both arms with an indescribably blissful smile towards the shepherds, who were standing in front of the shining fire. They bowed their heads humbly before the eyes of the child, but then they opened their bundles and took out the simple things and food they had brought with them. But the old man's soul trembled before the gaze of the child that fell from the shepherds onto the old man in the semi-darkness. At the same time, he was overcome with bitter shame that he had appeared empty-handed. Something poignant and mysterious forced down his cool and sharp thinking, and a shattering and powerful feeling took possession of him. "What have you brought me, old man?" the blue eyes of the child seemed to ask, and the question rang in him like the peal of 100 bells. He could not bear it, and at the same time felt a childish and fierce desire to hurry back and fetch the supply of wine and cold food he had brought with him on his travels. He stepped through the door into the open without looking back, and ran back the way he had come in a rush. The animals who were standing in front of the hut, as if listening with longing, gave way before him, and it became dark. A terrible weariness descended on him as he hurried along in the blowing snow. Abandonment and grief filled his eyes with tears, and his ears heard a distant singing in the air. But immediately the storm howled with renewed vigor, laughed in the treetops with whistling mockery, and hurled wreaths of snow and ringing icicles at the heavy-breathing old man who had long since lost his way. with the last of his strength. He groped his way between rough trunks and dense underbrush, and suddenly he slipped and fell. But immediately afterwards, men's hands seized him by the shoulders and set the half-stunned man on his feet. The yellow light of a lantern fell on his frightened face, and the words of fearful anger and frantic searching that were on the lips of his rescuers were not uttered. The train driver, who had been so badly scolded, knocked the snow off his clothes and led him by the arm to the train, which was not far out of the thicket. A dark group of curious fellow travelers awaited them after the missing passenger, who was now led back to his compartment. A new locomotive stood hissing and with bare snowplow in front of the old engine. I would like. There's a house in the forest with a newborn child. They're so poor there, stammered the old man. Everyone looked at him and didn't understand. Only the train guard, who had his own house nearby, said quietly to the conductor that he had said straight away that the track was headed for the woodcutter's hut. Yes, they were very poor there. And then they looked at the bills the old man gave them, beaming with joy. It was a lot of money for little people's Christmas. And the railroad guard put what was intended for the woodcutter's hut into the other pocket of his shirt. So the train continued its fiery course with a fresh roar and rolling wheels, and the old man sat alone again as before, only that his dead heart had blossomed like a rose, and the hot tears flowed down his cheeks, tears that nobody saw and nobody cared about. Long afterward, it was said of him that he had changed, and the people of the estate, who felt with happy amazement his newly awakened goodness, knew as little as other people that his heart had only been sick all these years, and that in one gracious night that peace had entered his heart, which is promised to all those who are of good will. And that's the end of the story. And I have goodwill. I wish goodwill to everyone this night. I hope you enjoyed the story, and till next time, thank you.